So working with the gradient mesh tool is really going to help you make your objects look more realistic in Illustrator. Um, there are some limitations, but for the most part, it's a really neat tool that you need to know how to use because in order to make things look 3D realistic, it's very important. So I'm starting with the circle here. It's a simple circle, just a primitive shape. And what I want to do is I want to make this circle appear to be a sphere. Now, as it is, I can only fill and stroke this shape. But what I want to do is I want to create a gradient mesh. And a mesh is very similar to what you see when you're working with 3D objects, which is a netting that you put around your shapes. Now, Illustrator is going to assume what I'm trying to make based on that primitive shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this shape, and I'm going to come over to my toolbox, and you can see that there's a mesh tool. Now you can also go to the object menu and create gradient mesh. Okay, and we'll do that in a second. But if you grab your mesh tool, what you're going to be doing is telling Illustrator where you want to start that netting. And the more you click on your object, the more points you're going to make. So let's just make a simple click right around here. Okay, when I clicked my object, what I did was I put my first point in. Now, because we're dealing with the netting, when you create a point, it also creates a line going vertically and horizontally. So your gradient mesh object is made up of points, patches, and lines. If I click again, say on top of this line, I create another point. Okay, and so this is a patch. These are lines and these are points. Now those points are where you're going to be adding color. Now right now this shape is white. So I'm going to make another point here. And notice that when I made this third point, it automatically made a point there. Because if you're dealing with the netting, you have to have the lines. So wherever those lines cross, it's going to create a new gradient mesh point. So now let's go in and let's start coloring, because this is really easy to do. You can use a couple of different tools to do this. We've already dealt with our regular selection tool and our direct selection tool. If you select this object with the regular selection tool, notice that all the points are selected. That means I can color this gradient mesh object, because that's what it's called, and I can color it overall, sort of the parent color for this shape. So if I come over here to my slider or my spectrum, I go ahead and establish that base color. But what I want to do is I want to add highlights and shadows and midtones to this shape to give it the impression that it's a sphere. So if I grab my direct selection tool and I just touch one of these points, I can then, let's go to my swatches, I can then go in and color that area. Okay, and the way coloring works with these mesh objects is the color will radiate out as far as it can until it fizzles out in relation to the next line. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I grab my gradient mesh tool again and I touch here, well, let's do it here. Notice that it made that section yellow, but let me say I want to make it a different color. So I select with my direct selection. Over here, make it blue. All right, notice it went as far as it could before it started mixing with this other color. Because these lines are closer together, that color is basically going to take up half of that patch. So I can grab my direct selection, I can move that point and see how my color becomes a little sharper. Okay, because it doesn't actually move that gradient over, it still keeps it to where it's half. So if I want a really sharp line, okay, you see what I'm talking about. So let me deselect that. Select it and undo. Okay, just edit, undo. And let me just make that green again. Find the right one. I chose a random green, but all right, so let me go through and make some adjustments. I'm going to recolor this. Select all. Okay. So I want to make this look like a sphere. Now every point on this gradient mesh object is able to be colored. So let me color this one. Do like a light green. I can select the points on the outside if I want and color those as well. And I can start to make a shape that is somewhat a solid sphere. Okay, so I can build my shapes up on this. Now, the problem with the gradient mesh object that you have to concern yourself with is once you make an object, a gradient mesh object, there's no going back. So I could go in and I could delete these points by selecting them and hitting the delete key on my keyboard, but it still remains a gradient mesh object. Even if I remove all these points, you see that I still have that. Now there's a workaround. Look that up on Google. It's a matter of offsetting your path and all this kind of thing, and I can show you guys in class how to do that. But just bear in mind that that's the problem. Now the more points you have, so the more meshing you deal with, the crazier your shape is going to appear, because you have to understand that every point can be manipulated and moved, and the color and things like that. Now that's kind of neat, but the problem is there's just too much to work with. So I mean, if you go in and you start pushing around, you start mixing things up like this, it's hard to get back from that because you've gone a little too far. So keep that in mind. Play around with this gradient mesh tool. I really think that it'll help you to make your objects appear to be solid in 3D. And this will help you give those light sources and those shadows to your objects that are really going to put them in space. Okay, so hope you enjoy that and work hard.